Thank you, Liz, and thank you all for being here. I want to start out by saying how special this is to be appearing in front of a group this large at this hour of the morning. I don't think I've ever given a talk to such a big group at 9 a.m. sharp, but I'm ready. And I want to, on a more serious note, just take a minute to recognize how special it is that you guys all come together, and many of you are repeat attenders, as I understand, to celebrate books and to talk about books. And I think that in our daily lives, we have so many ways to come together about things that are immediate to our own interests, whether they are around our kids' schools or around our local communities, even around politics, more often around the things that are right in front of us. And to come together and decide to spend a whole day talking about books is really making a commitment to talk about something far outside any of our particulars. And to me, that's really, it's kind of a spiritual thing that you all are doing. And thank you for including me in that conversation today. And thank you to the Pasadena Literary Alliance for putting it all together. So I have to correct one small thing in Liz's thing, that my thing was titled, "My Grandmother Was a Nazi," but I loved her. I'm just want to clarify. Was as in the beginning of World War II. So I'll tell you a little bit about what my book is about in very brief, because I can never focus on what people are talking about when they try to summarize what their book is about. But it's about three German women living in an abandoned castle in the aftermath of World War II. It begins in June of 1945, and these women have come together to try to, they're widows, and they are trying to raise their children and put food on the table and basically just put one foot in front of the other in the wake of this incredible devastation. As they do this, they begin to reckon with their pasts and what they have been doing or not doing for the last 10 or so years. And ultimately, they have to reckon with each other's pasts as well. They come together nominally because they are the widows of resistors. Their husbands were executed for their roles in the failed 20th of July assassination attempt on Hitler's life. However, as the story unfolds, you realize that actually they're not all exactly who they first appeared to be, and in fact, their experience of that time spans the gamut of the political experience of Germans of that time. As many of you are aware, the assassination attempt is a real historical event that happened. These characters, I did a ton of research about that, and I read memoirs of some of the widows, and I'll tell you a little more about that in a minute. But these characters are wholly fictional creations, so they are not, they're not representations of actual widows of the resistance. They're more composites, and more importantly, they're kind of characters that appeared to me the same way many fiction writers will tell you characters kind of come to them, wholly formed, as if it's someone you know, but they don't exist. It's a step away from a kind of insanity, I think. But in any case, these women span the gamut of the German political experience of that time, and I think of it really as much a book about complicity as it is about resistance. And it's very much set in the kind of gray area around the edges of the Holocaust, not right in the center of it. And as Liz mentioned, when I started writing this book, I was about 3.5 years into it. I had a newborn baby. I was starting to think, am I ever going to finish this book? Are my kids going to ask me one day, like, what were you doing? What were you doing in the library all those hours, Mom? And I had a conversation with a friend who was talking about another book that she was not going to read because she had World War II fatigue. She didn't know, this was sort of more of an acquaintance than a friend. She didn't know, she knew I was working on a book. She didn't know what the subject of my book was. And I thought, oh, it was like the nail in the coffin here. But then I mulled on that and worried about it, and then I realized that I too had a kind of World War II fatigue. And what it was a sense that I kept reading the same World War II stories. And they were important stories, and they were beautiful stories, and they were interesting stories, they were tragic stories. But there was this sense that every book I was reading was either a variation of something like the Diary of Anne Frank, like a victim story, or it was a kind of semi-voyeuristic exploration of some of the serious, like, arch villains of the Holocaust and the leaders or the depraved concentration camp guards. But I hadn't read a story that reflected my own family's connection to that time period. And I started to worry about why that was, and I realized it's kind of fraught to write a story about ordinary Germans and to create sympathetic characters who, at least in the beginning of the book and in the beginning of the novel, in the beginning of the time period, are actually willing members of the Nazi Party and, in fact, enthusiastic about what is going on with the Third Reich and what Hitler's bringing to the table. That felt kind of transgressive. And I think that's for good reason in some ways, because there's a skepticism about humanizing people who, when the whole category of Nazis is a category of people who took away other people's humanity. But at the same time, it struck me as a little dangerous to be able to keep reading the same stories and then feel like, okay, now I have World War II fatigue, let me close this, say never again, put that in the box and move on. When in fact, World War II was not that long ago. And in fact, I think we have a lot to learn from those people who actually were the ordinary Germans who kind of went along with it. And we're not all resistors in the beginning. We're by no means heroes, but we're not victims, but we're not all arch villains either. So that was where I wanted to situate this book. My reasons for that are deeply personal because I'm half German, and as Liz mentioned, I've talked about how I grew up with a sense of shame about being German. My mother immigrated to America as a 19-year-old. She was born in World War II in 1943, and came to America and never moved back to Germany, became an American citizen as soon as she could, and really raised me with a strong awareness of both the Holocaust, what had happened, which I can't remember a time in my life that I didn't know about, and the sense of responsibility that she felt as somebody who was German. But at the same time, I was absolutely fascinated by her childhood stories. I would hear my father, who's American, would talk about, being in the Boy Scouts and sailing down the Yonkers River and sort of homey American stories that were kind of quaint and interesting, but sort of in keeping with my own. They were like 30 years before my own childhood. My mother's stories, on the other hand, were like something out of the Laura Ingalls Wilder books that I loved. They were about walking to school barefoot because they never had any money for shoes, and shoes were hard to come by in post-war Germany. They were about only seeing chocolate and oranges once a year in Quaker care packages. They were about having to stay home and work on the harvest. She and her sisters would be kept home from school when it was time to pull up the potatoes. And this was in the mid-50s, and they were still farming with a horse and plow. So that was always really kind of compelling to me in a chastening way, but a very interesting way. And I also loved, at that point, we would go visit my grandparents in Germany almost every summer, and I loved going to Germany, and I loved especially my grandmother. So I had these two kind of competing things going on in my sense of what it meant to be half German. When I was 15, my mother passed away unexpectedly, so I never had the chance to really talk with her about all of these subjects and get more insight into her own conversations with her parents. But I spent a summer interviewing my grandmother, who was the closest thing I had to my mother. Started out with trying to learn more about my mother's childhood. This was when I was in college. This was quite a long time ago. But it morphed into learning a lot more about what my grandmother's experience of that time after the war was and what her experience of the war itself was. And what I learned was really interesting. She, unlike many people in her generation, wanted to talk about this. Not because she wanted to be forgiven. She wanted to be understood, I think. And I think often those things are confused. She didn't want to be excused. She didn't want to be forgiven. She wanted to kind of explain herself. So she talked about joining the Nazi Party in the late 30s, as many young people in Germany did, because there was opportunity that the party brought to the table. There was employment for a population that was vastly underemployed. And she and my grandfather led these youth groups that, for those of you who might have read the book, one of the characters has, this factors into the book, but there's this group called the Landjahr, which is like a year-long requirement. Under the Third Reich, this was a year-long requirement for German 14 and 15-year-old boys and girls to go spend a year on the farms, on these like camps in the German countryside, volunteering with local farmers. And the idea was that it was kind of teaching them agrarian skills that were going to help Germany turn back into this more agrarian nation, because they were all obsessed with what they were going to do when the food ran out. That was a big ecological concern for Hitler and for that time. And she ironically talked about her attraction to this as having come to it as an idealist, which is totally upside down world when you think about that. But she talked about how she was drawn to working in this place that was going to be very diverse, again, upside down world, and democratic, because the kids were coming from all over Germany. So they were the children of dock workers and factory workers living together with the children of aristocrats, and all coming together to do these wholesome agrarian things and learn, how to be out in the outdoors. And, this was all, at some point she said to me, it's kind of like, this was in the Clinton era, she said, it's kind of like that thing you have in your country that Clinton is putting into place, the National Service Program. And I was like, no, it's not like the National Service Program. But what I think she was trying to say was that was what it felt like to her. So what she was drawn to was not what many of us think of Germans of that time as having been drawn to. I never knew her to be a hateful person, an anti-Semitic person. I knew her only as a warm, generous, kind, and open-minded person. Who was curious about the world and loved meeting new people from different places. So I think that it was a very complicated thing for me to try to assimilate it was important to me to try to understand how the woman I knew and loved as my grandmother could have become a part of this movement that later became synonymous with evil. So that was really one of the main grains of this book. At the same time, was that quest. At the same time, I'm going to back up for 1 minute, because I want to say that till the end of her life, my grandmother would insist, I didn't know, which is a very difficult thing to parse, because from where we sit now, how could you not know? So I still am in that question. I don't know how to read that. But what I learned from thinking about this over the years it took me to write this book, and basically for my whole life, was kind of thinking that knowing exists on a gray scale. And in that gray scale, there is willful not knowing, and there's turning a blind eye. And on the other end, there's clear-sightedness and curiosity and moral examination. And I think that we can all fall somewhere in that in different situations in our lives. But it clearly meant a lot to her to think to herself, her own narrative involved, that she didn't know. So at some point I said to her, well, if you didn't know, tell me about, what did you think? What was the moment what did you think when you found out? What were you doing when you first saw the pictures of what was happening in these camps? And she said, I don't remember exactly. And I thought, well, that is totally weird. I was expecting a where were you when JFK died moment that would be really crystal clear. And then she explained, though, well, we saw some of those pictures of the liberation of Buchenwald and Dachau, the pictures that we know now, very archetypal, horrific pictures of the camps. She said, when I first saw those, it was at the very end of the war, but the Nazis were still in power, and they told us that we were told that those were Allied propaganda, and they were actually pictures of German prisoners of war in Russian camps. And there were German prisoners of war in Russian camps, so this was a plausible idea, I guess. But to me, that was extremely powerful. And she described having sort of had that knowledge, and it took her a while to assimilate and for her brain to follow the curve to, no, actually, that was not Allied propaganda, that's the truth. And she understood that and definitely spent the rest of her life actively reckoning with what it was she had enabled. But to me, that's something that also factors a lot into the inspiration for this book, is how the different ways that we self-deceive ourselves and the narratives we tell ourselves and that we get caught up in. The other end of the inspiration for this book is, it comes also from a personal place, that one of my mother's best friends in America was the daughter of a resistor. She and her family lived upstairs from us in the apartment building I lived in when I was very small. And so I also knew for my whole life that there was this other kind of German who had resisted, because this friend of my mother's father had been executed in the 20th of July assassination attempt. And when I was around the same time that I spent the summer interviewing my grandmother, I went with this friend of my mother's to her mother's 80th birthday celebration, which was kind of a reunion of widows of the resistance. And I was really struck in that community by how different the legacy of these men was, and how these family members who I was seeing had a really different connection to their heritage than I did. And it begged the question, how did these people see what was unfolding in front of their eyes in real time and have the courage to take action, whereas people like my grandparents did not? So the book ended up being an exploration of that I didn't necessarily start out thinking this is exactly what I'm doing, but that's where it kind of took me. I am still totally fascinated by World War II, and I don't have World War II fatigue. And I'll just share with you a couple of the things, the interesting things that came up in my research about both the war and especially about that time after the war that I found so fascinating as a child. So in the summer of 1945, there were between 15 and 20 million refugees or displaced people in Germany. For a country of 80 million people that is in ruins, with 40% of its housing and infrastructure bombed, to assimilate that many people was pretty remarkable. The last displaced persons camp didn't close until 1959. So this was sort of an ongoing situation in post-war life in Germany. And these camps were very, it was an amalgamation of people from all over. We're talking about concentration camp survivors who had nowhere to go after the war. We're talking about ethnic Germans who fled to the west from the east before the Russian advance. We're talking about Eastern Europeans who collaborated with the Nazis and were then afraid to go home because they would fear retribution from Stalin and the Soviets. So all of this sort of hodgepodge, this very uncomfortable combination of people was thrown into these camps, which ultimately sorted out a little bit into each specific category. But the fact that it stayed around until 1959 was really remarkable to me. There were also many German prisoners of war who were held after the war by the various allies. And the last German prisoner of war didn't come home from Siberia until 1956. So again, there's this whole period of time up through the 50s where the aftermath of the war was really an active presence in German life. But people really didn't talk about it very much. And I thought a lot about, and something that there's a scene in my book where I write about this, but I came across these posters that were put up in German town squares in that summer, kind of into the fall. And then quickly the Cold War kicked in, and there was the denazification process, as it was called, was sort of tamped down. But in that initial summer, there were a lot of posters up with pictures of the concentration camps and words like, "Who did this? You did," or "These sins, your guilt." And yet, so German people were walking by these all the time. They were part of your life, but they weren't talking about them. There was so much shame and guilt, for good reason, but there was little sort of what we think of here and today. I did a talk like this, and somebody said, "Well, didn't they have like discussion groups? I mean, I would just want to talk about it." I was like, that was not the ethos of that time. And so that was also something that I wanted to, it felt to me important to explore that in a novel, because I feel like that meant all of that processing was going on internally, and that is the province of a novel. So that's that. And